by Diane. Today we're going to the county seat. We're going to make this courthouse steps quilt. Come along and let's get busy quilting. This is the pattern that I've drawn up. It's called the courthouse steps pattern. It's similar to a log cabin quilt top, but you put the strips on in a little different order and it gives a different overall effect. It's a nice patchwork effect. The actual block is similar to the log cabin. You have your center, but then instead of going round and around with your strips, adding them, you add to the top and the bottom and then the left and the right. And so you stack them up a little bit differently and they look like the steps going up to the courthouse. We're going to need 48 blocks. It's a 6 across, 8 down, so 48 blocks, and we'll go over the fabric requirements in just a moment. For this quilt, we're going to need 5 colors. We need our center, and then we have 4 different colors of logs that go around it. It's a nice patchworky quilt. I have chosen to use some prints today instead of just solids, and so we'll see how that works out. I've chosen 5 fabrics that bring the color out in each other. For my center, I'm going to use this dark brown because it brings out the darkest shade of this apricot brown color here. The second color is the lighter apricot. I like that with it. The third one is got this beautiful blue in the background with the apricots. The fourth one has the apricot and the blue, but it blends into the black. And the fifth fabric is the same pattern line, but with a black background. We're going to have our center here. We're going to cut it 2.5 inches wide because it's a finished 2. All of the other strips we're going to cut 1.5 inches wide because it will be a finished 1 inch. So we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We should wind up with a finished 8-inch block. So this square, when we get it done, should measure 8.5 by 8.5 because our seam widths will still be on the sides. So make sure as you do your squares that they measure correctly or our quilt will not come out right and will be disappointing. So let's get busy and we'll start cutting our fabrics now. We're ready to start cutting fabric now. I have my first fabric that I want to cut. Now for this fabric I need 1.5 inch strips. I'm going to need 18 strips to make my blocks, or approximately. I'll probably cut maybe 12 and then cut them as I need them because sometimes fabrics are wider than others and I don't like to waste, so I don't want to cut too many strips, but I'm going to cut about 12 and see how far that goes. Now this fabric needed ironing, so I ironed it, but I don't usually iron unless I need to. I want to take the fabrics and get my selvages even. Now the selvages are the parts with the writing or the white line or the holes where it was hooked to the machine. Get your selvages even and get your fabric up where it will hang. We want it to hang straight with no blousiness. If there's any blousiness, we need to work that out, sliding it left or right. Now, I'm not worried about the right side hanging straight. I just want the bottom. Now, when I get it hanging straight, I'm going to put it down with the selvages at the top away from me. I'm going to hand press and take the crease at the bottom and fold it up to where it is the same distance from the top up here. I want to be able to see that back fabric to make sure that I did not go too far. So now we have the same amount of the back one showing up here. We don't care if this side is even or not. We're going to take care of that in just a minute. Now I like rulers that I can see through and they do the job, but to square up fabric you need at least 6 inches on the bottom and enough to span the height of your fabric. If I didn't fold this up, it would be taller and I would need to use my 6 by 24. But I don't have that much arm length and so I don't want to do that. So I folded up an extra time. I'm going to put it over. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to cut off the right edge. I want to get it even with the bottom down here. Make sure all of my edges are showing on the right because I want to cut all 4 layers. Trim off just a little bit to make sure you got them all. Now use one good firm stroke. Kind of do that abdominal crunch thing as you go, and press down, have a good nice sharp blade, and you'll be good. So that should come off in one time. Don't saw it, don't pick it up and move everything. Try to get it in one. Now I'm going to fold this up here where I can flip my mat around and be working to where I cut on the right side of the ruler each time. Now I need 1.5 inch strips. So I'm going to line the 1.5 inch line and get that top. This is what we went by to start with, so make sure it's even with the top now. One good stroke. There's one. Let's do another one. We'll do about 12 and see how we go, and if we need some more, we'll cut them. If we want to make a smaller quilt, we don't need as many. But I'm going to cut them and stack them and get all of my fabrics cut and ready, and then we'll start sewing. So I'll be back in just a few minutes. To cut my center squares, they're a finished 2 inches, so we need to cut 2.5 inch squares. We cut 2.5 inch strips from this. So now I want a ruler close to the size of what I'm working on. I don't want my big 15 inch square to work on this, so I'm going to get a smaller ruler. I have a 4.5 inch, which comes in nicely for these. Now I've got my strip lined up, edges together, and I'm going to get my ruler even with the top and cut the selvages off. You do not want this showing in your quilt. I get beautiful quilts in sometimes and the selvage will show. If you accidentally wind up with some of your selvage showing, there are some permanent markers or permanent color pencils that you can color it with so that it won't detract from the quilt. Okay, I want to find my 2.5 inch line. If you cannot find it easily, they make neon tape that you can put on the line. Line up your 2.5 and your 2.5. Hold your ruler steady and cut. Move it out of the way. Get to the next one. Get your left edge and your bottom even and cut. Now I need 48 of these squares. So I'm going to go ahead and cut those. If you're comfortable stacking your fabrics, I can stack all 3 strips on top of each other and cut 6 at a time. But if you're not comfortable with that and you cut wrong, you mess up 6 at a time. So make sure you get your confidence built up before you try that. There's one thing you need to know about the block before we get started. You're going to have a center, and then you're going to have, I put my 2 lighter ones on either side and then my 2 darker ones. When you're doing this, you're going to sew a light one to the center and a dark, this other light to the center. And then you're going to sew this one to this unit and this one to this unit. However, as you're doing your blocks, you need to make sure that this color is next to this color, which is next to this color, which is next to this color. If you make some of the blocks and everything is like this, and then you make more blocks and you switch these 2 colors, they're not going to go into the quilt right. So make sure the same ones are next to each other. And I go ahead and make 1 block just so I can have it there to look at. Make sure I like the colors. So I'm going to take my brown center and sew the apricot to it and the blue to it. And then I'll iron the seams toward the new strip. Then I'm going to sew this one between the blue and the apricot on one side, and this one between the blue and the apricot on the opposite side. Once you get started, you have to make sure they're in the right orientation. After that, it's not a problem, but don't flip these 2 or these 2 or it won't work. So we'll get started sewing now. We're going to chain sew these so that we can get them done in a hurry. We need 48. I've done 1, so I need 47 more. So we'll get started. The first thing I'm going to sew to my center square is the apricot and the blue. So I need a strip of each of those, and we'll get started sewing. I'm going to take my apricot strip and put it down. Now there's some selvage up here. Don't use the selvage. Come down below it. And I want to take my 2.5 inch square and put it face down on it. Now wherever your scant 1/4 inch is, that's what you need to sew. I have mine adjusted so that my scant 1/4 inch is to the right of my foot. Okay, I want to put my fingers on the threads back here just to keep them from jerking down in there. Once I get started, I'm okay. Line the side up with the side over here, but watch the side of your foot wherever your fabric is supposed to ride for your scant 1/4 inch. That's what you want to make sure of. I know where my needle is. I know where this is back here. I'm going to take another one. Leave just a slight amount of material between them, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and start your next one. When we get ready to iron these, I have found, excuse me, I've got it upside down. I found the easiest way to do it is to place it on your ironing surface with the new strip up, because all of the little parts are attached to that. I'm going to take my steam iron and I'm going to press. I don't want to dislodge any of this, so I'm going to go up and down with my iron. Now peel the new strip back and just bump it open without moving the lower pieces. You get the hang of this real quick. And then I'm just going to take my scissors and snip between them. I don't have my long scissors here, but snip between them and we'll have this done. To cut these apart, I'm going to just cut straight in and get this extra piece off. And then eyeball it at a 90° and cut each of these apart. They're kind of magnetized to the ironing board, so that makes it easy. And I'm going to continue to cut them apart and then stack them, and we'll get the next strip on. We've sewn our center square to our first small log. Now we have to attach the small log on the other side. So I have my block here. I have the center and the first small log. So the blue is going to go on this side over here. So I'm going to turn them to where that side is against the sewing machine. And I only have my blue strips, and we know we're right. So we'll get sewing now. I'm going to take my stack of 47 pieced sections with the center and the apricot on the one side. I want to flip it to where I'm sewing the blue to the opposite side. I'm going to get the right edges even. I'm coming down below the selvage here. I want to sew a little bit below. And then needle down, get the right edges even, and sew at that scant 1/4 inch. Almost to the edge of it. Pick up the next one and just chain all of these through. Here's my finished block. Here is the center with the apricot and the blue. I want to make sure this dark print winds up on that side. So to do that, I have to have them in this position. I'm going to flip this onto the black and sew it. So I want to make sure my pieces are apricot, brown, and then blue, and I'll just pick them up and set them on this strip each time. So we'll get started sewing these second ones on. Also, if the apricot and the blue stick out past the edge a little bit, when you put it on your strip, line up the center block and then eyeball it past the other two. If they stick out a little bit, that's fine. Let them stick out. Just make sure the bottom piece runs even with where your scant 1/4 inch would be. I have finished our block with the center, the apricot, the blue, and the dark print over here. We have to add the light print on this side, and if we put it in the position on the block, we see that everything is correct, and we're going to take one of our light strips and put on that side. So if I have my light strip and I flip my piece onto it this way, it will come out right. So we're going to sew these together. The blue should be on the top as we sew, and we should be sewing it to the side of the brown center that does not have anything on it yet. So let's get busy with that, and we'll iron the seams when we get done. Remember to iron it with the new strip on the top so that it will iron toward the new strip. Here's my original block. I need 47 more of these. Here's the block that we're working on. We have gotten our center, our two lights, and our two darkers. fabrics on there. So now we're ready to start back where we began again. We need another apricot. So I'm going to add an apricot and then another blue. We're going to keep doing this until we get it this size. Each time you add one, do it in the order you had it. Make sure you're putting it on the right side. You can't really mess up after this point as far as color placement. You're always putting the same color that was previously on that side. So we'll get busy and get some more blocks on this apricot fabric and iron them and keep going until we get our courthouse steps done. I added the second apricot strip. So now we have it sitting next to the block. We're ready to put the other blue strip on, the second blue strip. So I'm going to put it in this position so I can flip this block on top of it and then sew it, and I know it'll be right. We'll do all 47 of these, iron them, and then come back for the next strip. Okay, here's the completed block, and here's the block I'm working on. I've got my center and 2 steps on each side, and I need 3. So I'm going to go around it one more time with each color, starting with the apricot, the blue, and then the 2 florals, and we'll have all our blocks done and be ready to put them together. I'm moving right along with my block. If you get lost and you're not sure where you're supposed to be, you can go back to the center and count out how many you've got. You know your 2 first ones are the size of the center. I should have 1, 2, 3 this way and 1, 2, 3 this way. Same thing in the other 2 directions. So on this one I've got my center and I've got 1, 2, 3 of the apricot or peach color. The next one will be 1, 2. So I need to put my blue on next. You can keep up with it that way. You have to have the stair-step effect on each side, and they have to go on in the right order. So we're ready to put this blue on next. All of the quilt blocks are made. They're in place. We just have to sew them together in rows and we'll have our quilt top finished. It is much better than I even imagined. I love the colors together. So we'll start sewing blocks together next. It's important with this quilt pattern to make sure that we keep our blocks in the right orientation. You should have large areas of each of the 4 colors if the blocks are put together correctly. In other words, when you put your blocks up here, always put the same colors next to the preceding block and your pattern will work out. Now to sew our rows together, we're going to sew all of row 1 into one long skinny thing. All of row 2, all of 3. Do all the rows that way. And to get row 1 together, I'm going to take the second block and turn it onto the first block and sew the seam. I'll iron the seam, put it back up there, do the next block, and we'll continue this until we get all our rows together. We have block 1 on top of underneath block 2. Well, I've put them together, same color fabrics together, and on this side and on the opposite side we won't have any seams to deal with. So we're just going to start sewing, get the top edge and the right edge even, start sewing, get the bottom even, come down here and finish up. Now I did not square all of my blocks up. If you want to do that you can, but if you're careful sewing, they're pretty close, and so you shouldn't have a problem. So we'll start sewing now and get this quilt top together. I usually use a thread that is neutral throughout whatever quilt I'm making, so I don't have to change threads and it won't show. Now I'm going to get the top edge and the right edge even. I'm going to put my hand on my threads so that they don't get jerked down into the machine, and I'm going to get that right edge even and take a few stitches. Leave your needle down, go to the other end, even it up, pinch it together. Don't really pull on it, but make sure it's evenly stretched out. And then we'll get number 4 and sew it to number 3, and we'll continue until we get row 1 together. I started sewing block number 4 to number 3, and again we have the same colors together. I started sewing, left my needle down, but when I come to this end to get them even, remember how we rough cut them? We didn't stop and we just whacked them apart on the ironing board. One of these sticks out longer than the other one. So in that case, I'm going to come over to these strips that go the other way, get them even at the bottom, and make it work out to that length. You can either square up all your squares or just do it this way. Either one works. I have row 1 completed. It's 6 blocks long. I just have come up with a method of when I put quilts together, I take the rows, and if possible, I'm going to press all of these seams to the left and the next row to the right. It just works easy for putting the rows together later on, so we're going to do that. Okay, I have row 1 completed and row 2 completed. You'll notice the blues and the peaches match up across here. When we sewed our blocks together, it was 2 solid pieces, so we didn't have to worry about any seams. When we sew row 1 to row 2, we want to match up the center seam because one is going to the left and one is going to the right. But when these other seams meet on either side, just make one go in one direction and one in the other. It doesn't matter. We're going to press this anyway afterwards, but we want to make sure that we always lock our seams no matter where they are. So as you come to these other seams, just flip the bottom one down, whichever way is easier. And then make sure that when you get to these center seams, they should be going in opposite directions, and make sure they lock good. Okay, I am at the machine ready to sew row 1 to row 2. We want to get this edge up here even. We want to get this edge even down here, not up here. These were those raw edges we trimmed. So get the right edge here even. And if you'll notice, this back one sticks out a little. I'm going to go by the front one because the front one lines up with this line right here. We're going to put our needle down, sew a little bit, and then we have these 2 seams right here. I'm going to flip the back one down and the top one up and make them nest. And then we shouldn't have any problem with it. So we'll get started here. I'm going to get the top edges even. Take a few stitches and stop with it down. I'm going to reach under here and flip that bottom seam toward me so the top seam is going up. I can manage it better that way. And make them nest. Make them just, take your finger and mash on it so that they stay in each other. If you have a seam ripper or a stiletto, this is a good time to use that. I usually use a seam ripper with the dull side down. Orange sticks are really good. The ones you do your fingernails with. I want to come down here and line these next seams up. Get almost to them. The bottom one's toward me and the top one's toward me. So I'm going to flip the top one up this time. I like the bottom one to be going in the direction I'm going. I don't have to watch it that way. So I'm going to press this top one up. Let it go under the needle. Now we're to the seam that should be between the blocks. And that's matching up well. I'm going to nest it and press down with my seam ripper. And we're going to do this all the way down. Then when we iron this seam, we're going to iron it in one direction, open it up, and then we're going to open the seam wide so that it will be flat. I've sewn row 1 to row 2. And now I'm going to place it on the ironing board, still folded just like I sewed it. And I'm going to set this seam. And then I'm going to open it and just bump it open toward me. Now I want to flip it completely over like this. And this seam should be going away from me. And I want it to do that. I'm going to come in here with my iron and open. Now put the nose down and the back end, kick it up where it won't uniron everything you've already ironed on this quilt. Now we want to check where our blocks meet. I've got pretty little T's, and then where our other seams meet. I did pretty good on those. Yeah, they look good. Okay. Now we'll put these up there and do another row. At this time, if these little areas that stick out on you bother you, you can put them up there with a long ruler and just trim it off even with the logs in the regular block. You can do that on either side, and then when you do the next rows, they'll be easier, but they don't bother me. I just learned to go by the log here instead of the ends. The quilt center is complete. I have all the blocks sewn together in rows and all the rows sewn together into the center of the quilt. And I have ironed all my seams, so now we're ready to put borders on it. The first border, I want a narrow one and about 1.5 inch cut, so it'll be a 1 inch that shows up. I'm going to measure the quilt in the center from left to right. Do that twice. Write it down and double check it before you cut. I'm going to cut some strips 1.5 inches wide, put them together into one long thin strip, and then cut a piece long enough for the top and bottom, whatever that measurement was, and attach it to the top and the bottom, and we'll get our first border on. I measured my quilt from side to side, got my measurement, made sure it was accurate, and then I sewed my border pieces, these blue strips. I cut them 1.5 inches wide, sewed them end to end. I cut 2 pieces the width of my quilt, and I have pinned one to the top and one to the bottom. Now I pinned them so that the border strip, the blue strip, will be on the bottom when I sew, so that I won't have to deal with any seams, not very many seams. You may have one in there. As you're sewing this border strip on, start at the edge, get them even, take a couple of stitches, leave your needle down, and start taking your pins out just before you get to them. Do not sew over a pin or you can damage your machine. I'll get these 2 strips on and then we'll measure the other 2. I have my first border on the top and the bottom. I'm going to put it on my ironing board with the border on top. I'm going to set the seam and then peel it up and gently iron it toward me so the border seam goes toward the border. So set that first portion, go down to the next section and do the same until you have all of the borders ironed out. I put the quilt back on my board sideways so I wouldn't have to bend over to measure. I'm going to measure from the left to the right and get the length of the quilt. Measure it once, write it down, double check, 69.5, and we'll get those cut. I have the first border on all the way around. It's looking really nice. I'm going to decide which fabric to use for the next border, and it's going on the same way. I'm going to measure from left to right, do that twice and make sure your number's right, and cut strips of my border fabric. I'm going to cut them 6.5 inches wide and put them together, and then cut strips that length for the top and bottom. Then I'll measure from top to bottom again, do the same thing, put them on those sides. The quilt top is finished. I'm very pleased with how it turned out. We've learned a new block. We've reviewed a lot of techniques that go into good quality quilt top making, and I hope you've had a little fun along the way. Until I see you again, happy quilting.